Hey guys, being tired in the Middle Ages was not just a matter of working hard or going to bed too late. It was built into the body by cold rooms, smoky air, uncertain food, broken sleep, illness, fear, and a world where even rest could be physically uncomfortable. Before we settle into that world, tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support it. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating history like this, you're very welcome to subscribe. Now let's step into a medieval morning, when tiredness was not an interruption to life, but one of its most ordinary conditions. Before sunrise, the room is already awake in small ways. A child coughs near the hearth. Someone shifts beneath a woolen blanket that smells faintly of smoke, sweat, and damp straw. The fire has gone low, and the air has that particular coldness of stone, timber, and earth before dawn. There may be no clock in the modern sense, only the sense that darkness is thinning, that animals are beginning to stir, that a bell may soon ring somewhere beyond the walls or across the fields. For many medieval people, tiredness did not begin with labor. It began with the night itself. Modern viewers often imagine the past as quieter, slower, perhaps even more restful. No electric light, no screens, no traffic outside the window at 2 in the morning. But a world without modern noise was not necessarily a world of deep sleep. It was a world of fleas and lice, of damp bedding, of smoke trapped indoors, of infants sleeping close to adults, of animals nearby, of illness untreated, of worry carried physically in the body. Darkness arrived early, but darkness did not guarantee comfort. And this is one of the first misunderstandings worth gently setting aside. Medieval people did not simply sleep more because the sun went down. Their sleep was shaped by the season, by class, by work, by hunger, by religious rhythms, by fear, by overcrowding, and by the fragile materials of ordinary life. Some nights were long. Some were badly broken. Some began early and ended before the body was ready. Some were interrupted by bells, by animals, by childbirth, by brewing, by guarding, by prayer, or by the simple need to keep a fire alive. To understand what it meant to be tired all the time in the Middle Ages, we have to move beyond the image of peasants merely rising with the sun. We have to ask what their bodies had endured before the work even started. In a rural household, especially among the poor, the bed itself was rarely a private island of rest. It might be a straw mattress, a sack filled with chaff, or a pile of rushes renewed when possible and endured when not. Bedding could harbor insects. The warmth of shared sleeping made sense in a cold climate, but it also meant movement, noise, smell, and interruption. Privacy was a luxury. So was cleanliness. So was quiet. A person might sleep beside a spouse, children, perhaps a servant or relative, while livestock occupied another part of the same building or an adjoining space. That arrangement was practical. Animals were valuable, vulnerable to theft, and useful for warmth. But practicality often came at the expense of rest. Hooves shifted. Cows breathed heavily. Pigs made noise. A sick animal could keep a household alert through the night, because the loss of one beast might mean hunger later. Here, a small domestic detail reveals something larger. Medieval tiredness was not only physical. It was economic. Sleep could be disturbed by the knowledge that the household was always near risk. A failed harvest, a dead ox, a spoiled batch of grain, a tax demand, a sick child, an injury at the wrong season. Any of these could press on the mind. The medieval body rested inside systems that offered very little margin. And yet, medieval people were not helpless or foolish in the face of fatigue. They had habits, rhythms, and forms of adaptation that made sense within their world. One of the more intriguing features of pre-modern sleep is the likelihood that many people experienced the night in two phases. They might sleep for several hours after dark, wake for a period in the middle of the night, and then sleep again until morning. That waking interval could be used for prayer, quiet conversation, tending the fire, nursing a child, relieving oneself, or simply lying awake in the dark. To us, waking in the middle of the night can feel like failure. To them, it may often have felt ordinary. But ordinary does not mean easy. The body might accept broken sleep as a rhythm and still carry fatigue into the day. Especially in winter, when cold seeped into walls and bedding, the long night could become less a soft retreat than a negotiation. A person might wake because the fire had died, because damp had entered the straw, because someone nearby was coughing, because the roof let in rain, or because hunger had sharpened after a thin supper. Food is one of the quieter keys to medieval tiredness. It is easy to describe medieval labor as exhausting, but labor is felt differently depending on what fuels it. For many ordinary people, daily food was heavily dependent on grain. Bread, pottage, ale, and whatever vegetables, legumes, dairy, eggs, fish, or meat could be obtained according to region, season, wealth, and religious rules. In good times, this could sustain hard work. In bad times, it left the body depleted. The word famine can sound dramatic and distant, as if it only belongs to catastrophic years. But tiredness lived in the smaller gradients between enough and not enough. There were seasons when stores ran low before the next harvest. There were years when bread was darker, thinner, stretched with whatever could be used. There were times when the poor ate, but did not eat well enough to feel strong. A body can keep moving for a long time on inadequate food, can walk, dig, carry, reap, knead, wash, haul, and pray, but it does so under a kind of inward dimming. And in the Middle Ages, that dimming was often interpreted through a very different language from ours. A person might not say they were suffering from chronic fatigue, anemia, malnutrition, sleep deprivation, respiratory irritation, or overwork. They might describe heaviness, weakness, melancholy, imbalance, sin, bodily corruption, or divine testing. Medieval medicine, inherited partly from ancient traditions, often explained health through the balance of humors. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, rest, diet, purging, bleeding, prayer, and regimen all had their place in attempts to restore order. This does not mean people failed to recognize exhaustion. They knew what weariness felt like. They saw bodies wear down. Monastic writers, physicians, laborers, mothers, soldiers, pilgrims, and clerks all lived with fatigue in different forms. But their explanations were shaped by the intellectual and spiritual world around them. That matters because how a culture explains tiredness also shapes how it treats tired people. In a peasant household, tiredness was rarely a reason to stop. The work was too seasonal, too tied to survival. At certain times of year, especially harvest, the demands could become relentless. Harvest was not merely a picturesque gathering of golden grain. It was a race against weather, spoilage, hunger, rents, and obligations. Men, women, children, and hired hands might all be drawn into urgent labor. The body bent and straightened, under sun, damp, wind, or rain. Hands blistered, backs ached, sleep shortened, meals became functional. Everyone knew the work had to be finished. But here is the reversal. The Middle Ages were not one continuous stretch of frantic labor. The calendar also contained holy days, feasts, saints' days, local festivals, Sundays, and periods when some forms of work paused. Compared with modern industrial time, medieval time was not always uniformly scheduled. It could be intensely demanding, then irregularly interrupted by religious observance or seasonal slowdown. So the tiredness of medieval life was not necessarily the same as the modern tiredness of endless clock-time productivity. It was more uneven, more bodily, more dependent on weather, hunger, daylight, and obligation. That unevenness is important. A medieval worker might not experience every day as maximum labor. Winter could bring shorter outdoor work, repair tasks, spinning, caring for animals, and indoor maintenance. But winter also brought cold, darkness, illness, smoke, and food scarcity. Summer brought longer daylight and more labor, but also warmth and, in good years, better access to fresh foods. So tiredness changed its texture with the year. It had seasons. Imagine, for a moment, the fatigue of late winter. The grain stores are lower. Salted foods may be wearing thin. Fresh vegetables are limited. The house is smoky from months of indoor fire. Clothes are heavy, perhaps damp, washed less often than a modern person would wish, and slow to dry. Bodies are indoors more, close together, sharing air. Coughs linger. Children become restless. Adults become short-tempered. The promise of spring is real, but not yet useful. Then imagine the fatigue of late summer harvest. Now there is light, heat, urgency. The tiredness is less cold and stagnant, more muscular and immediate. Sleep may come quickly from exertion, but the body wakes sore. The hands and shoulders carry yesterday into today. A storm on the horizon can make everyone move faster. Rest becomes not a right, but something stolen between tasks. The medieval person knew both forms of tiredness. The slow winter heaviness, the harvest exhaustion, the restless fatigue of hunger, the fog of fever, the ache of smoke-filled lungs, the spiritual weariness of fear, the dullness that comes when life never quite offers enough privacy, softness, warmth, or certainty. And we should pause over smoke, because it is one of the most easily forgotten features of medieval life. The hearth was essential. It cooked food, warmed the household, dried clothes, provided light, and gathered family activity. But indoor fires, especially in poorly ventilated spaces, meant smoke exposure. Chimneys became more common over time and varied by region and wealth, but many poorer dwellings endured smoky interiors. Eyes stung, throats irritated, coughs worsened. Infants and the elderly would have been especially vulnerable. A tired body breathing smoky air does not recover the same way as a body breathing clean air. The hearth that preserved life also wore at it. This is one of those medieval contradictions that appears again and again. The same thing could be necessary and harmful, comforting and exhausting, protective and punishing. Light was another contradiction. Without abundant artificial lighting, evenings were darker and quieter in some ways, but not always restful. Candles were expensive for many households. Rushlights, hearth glow, and moonlight gave limited illumination. Work that required seeing had to be arranged around daylight or low light. This gave the day a natural structure, but it also created pressure. When light was available, tasks had to be done. In winter, short daylight compressed necessary work. In summer, long daylight extended it. The church bells helped divide time, especially in towns and religious communities. In monasteries, the hours of prayer structured day and night with particular intensity. For monks and nuns, tiredness had a spiritual dimension. Night offices could interrupt sleep. Rising in darkness to chant psalms was not an accident of poor planning. It was part of a sacred discipline. The body's discomfort was folded into devotion. Weariness could be seen as offering training, struggle, even purification. But monastic tiredness was not all serene candlelight and quiet Latin chanting. It could be deeply physical. Cold stone floors, early rising, repeated prayer, fasting, manual labor, reading in dim light. the strain of communal life. The battle against aesthesia, often translated imperfectly as spiritual sloth or listlessness, was not laziness in the modern sense. It was a kind of oppressive weariness of soul, a restlessness, a heaviness that made prayer and duty feel empty. Medieval religious writers took it seriously because they knew that exhaustion could enter the spirit as well as the muscles. Outside the monastery, fatigue had other moral meanings. Medieval society often valued endurance, duty, and acceptance of hardship. Complaining too much could be judged harshly, especially among those expected to labor. Yet elite people also feared overexertion, imbalance, and bodily depletion. A nobleman, scholar, or cleric might receive advice about rest, diet, air, bathing, sleep, and moderation. In other words, rest was not unknown as a medical or moral good. It was simply not equally available. Class shaped tiredness profoundly. A noble household might have better bedding, warmer rooms, more varied food, servants to perform heavy tasks, and access to physicians or healers. But nobility did not eliminate fatigue. Aristocratic life carried its own strains. Travel over poor roads, political anxiety, pregnancy and childbirth for noblewomen, military campaigning for men, administrative burdens, court attendance, and the performance of status. Comfort existed, but it was fragile and uneven by modern standards. A noble bed might be richly furnished compared with a peasant's straw mattress, yet the chamber could still be cold. A castle could be imposing and drafty at once. Fine clothes could be beautiful and cumbersome. Feasts could display abundance, but digestion, disease, and the absence of modern medicine remained common realities. The elite could soften medieval life. They could not escape being medieval. For women, tiredness often had particular rhythms that are easy to understate. In peasant and artisan households, women's work included food preparation, brewing, dairying, childcare, washing, spinning, gardening, market activity, animal care, and seasonal agricultural labor. Much of this work was repetitive, necessary, and physically demanding. It did not always appear in records with the same visibility as rents, battles, offices, or guild regulations, but it held daily life together. Pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and child loss added layers of bodily and emotional exhaustion. A mother might sleep lightly because an infant needed feeding, because a child was ill, because the household had to be ready before others rose. Childcare did not pause the rest of the work. It accompanied it. A woman might stir pottage, carry water, mend cloth, nurse a baby, watch toddlers near the hearth, and prepare for the next round of labor, all while recovering from pregnancy or living with nutritional strain. The tiredness of medieval motherhood, then, was not merely sentimental hardship. It was structural. It came from the way survival tasks overlapped in one body. Children, too, were not outside this world of fatigue. Poor children might help with animals, gather fuel, fetch water, watch younger siblings, scare birds from fields, spin, carry, clean, or assist in workshops. Childhood existed, affection existed, play existed, but the boundary between child and worker could be porous. A tired child in the Middle Ages was not unusual. Small bodies were woven early into the economy of the household. And yet, to make this history trustworthy, we must avoid flattening medieval life into misery. People laughed. They slept well sometimes. They enjoyed ale, songs, festivals, warmth, companionship, stories, courtship, religious celebration, and seasonal relief. They had skills we have lost. They knew the land, the weather, animals, tools, and materials intimately. Many had rhythms of community that modern isolation does not easily replace. The point is not that medieval people were always suffering. The point is that tiredness was more accepted as part of the fabric of life, and the means of escaping it were limited. Comfort was not evenly distributed. Recovery depended on weather, food, health, class, gender, age, and luck. This is why the subject is more layered than simply saying, people worked hard, work mattered, but tiredness also came from everything surrounding work. The bed, the air, the diet, the fear of scarcity, the darkness, the church calendar, the body's untreated ailments, the dampness in the walls, the constant nearness of other people and animals, the absence of modern pain relief, and the social expectation that life was supposed to be hard. And as we move deeper into this world, the next question becomes even more revealing. If nearly everyone was tired in some way, how did medieval society decide which forms of tiredness were normal, which were honorable, and which were dangerous? A laborer collapsing from exhaustion in the field might be viewed with sympathy if illness was visible, but ordinary fatigue itself was rarely considered exceptional. The body was expected to endure. Medieval society, especially in its rural and working environments, was built around necessity rather than comfort. There were animals to feed before dawn, grain to grind, cloth to produce, roads to travel, walls to repair, fires to maintain. Tiredness became suspicious only when it disrupted obligation too severely, or when it appeared tied to moral weakness rather than circumstance. This is one reason medieval descriptions of laziness can feel surprisingly harsh to modern readers. In sermons, moral writings, and legal complaints, idleness was often treated not merely as inefficiency, but as danger. A person who avoided labor threatened the fragile balance of household and village survival. In a world where most people lived close to subsistence, another person's failure to contribute could become everyone's problem. But there was an irony hidden inside this harshness. Medieval people often condemned idleness while simultaneously living with forms of exhaustion that modern medicine would recognize as deeply debilitating. Chronic pain, nutritional deficiency, parasitic infection, untreated dental disease, recurring fevers, arthritis, childbirth injuries, respiratory illness from smoke exposure, and badly healed wounds all shaped daily energy levels. Many people who appeared merely weak or slow may have been carrying physical burdens that nobody around them could truly diagnose. And because medieval medicine had limited tools, the line between character and health could become blurred. A person unable to rise early might be judged spiritually lax. A worker frequently exhausted might be seen as lacking discipline or proper temperament. Melancholy, spiritual despair, bodily heaviness, and physical depletion could merge together in confusing ways. This becomes especially visible in monastic writings, where the emotional experience of fatigue was examined with remarkable seriousness. Monks described periods of mental dullness so profound that reading sacred texts became difficult. Prayer could feel empty, time slowed, the body resisted discipline. Some writers described staring out windows, unable to focus, waiting desperately for the next bell or meal. Modern readers sometimes recognize something surprisingly familiar in these passages. The flattened mind of exhaustion, the strange heaviness that turns even simple tasks into effort. Yet medieval people interpreted these feelings through religious frameworks. A monk might understand persistent weariness as temptation, spiritual attack, imbalance, or insufficient devotion. The body and soul were not neatly separated. Fatigue could be moralized, sanctified, feared, or accepted depending on context. Outside religious life, towns introduced their own forms of tiredness. Medieval cities were not vast industrial centers in the modern sense, but they were physically demanding environments. Streets could be crowded, muddy, noisy, and foul-smelling. Craft workers often labored in conditions that strained the body in repetitive ways. Blacksmiths endured heat and smoke. Tanners worked with chemicals and rotting hides. Millers inhaled flour dust. Weavers bent for long hours over looms. Apprentices rose early and worked under strict expectations. Nighttime did not necessarily bring silence. Inns, workshops, carts, church bells, and livestock all contributed to interruption. And urban sleep carried another problem: insecurity. A medieval town after dark was not automatically safe. Fire was a constant danger. So was theft. Gates might close at night. Watchmen patrolled streets with varying levels of effectiveness. Travelers arriving late could find themselves stranded outside city walls. Inns offered shelter, but not always restful shelter. Shared sleeping arrangements remained common. Vermin remained common. Noise remained common. The wealthy had more opportunities for private chambers, heavier curtains, feather beds, and insulated spaces. But even among elites, uninterrupted comfort was elusive. Servants moved through rooms. Candles burned low. Fires required maintenance. Winter cold penetrated stone structures. And political life itself could be exhausting in ways less visible than field labor. A medieval nobleman might spend weeks riding in harsh weather, sleeping inconsistently while moving between estates or courts. Travel itself was physically draining. Roads were rough, muddy, and slow. Journeys that modern people complete in hours could require days. Riders endured rain, cold, saddle sores, poor roadside lodging, and constant uncertainty about conditions ahead. Even kings often traveled continuously rather than ruling from one permanent palace. Courts moved. Administrations moved with them. Entire households shifted across landscapes not designed for comfort. Fatigue followed power as surely as it followed poverty. For noble women, exhaustion often hid beneath ideals of refinement and courtly life. High-status women supervised households, managed servants, arranged food stores, oversaw textile production, handled correspondence, navigated marriage politics, and endured repeated pregnancies that carried real danger. Childbirth itself was exhausting enough. Recovery afterward could be incomplete before the cycle began again. And because infant mortality remained tragically common, emotional fatigue settled into households alongside physical fatigue. Parents invested love and labor into children while knowing, at least subconsciously, how fragile survival could be. Grief was not rare interruption. It was part of the emotional climate of medieval life. This constant proximity to illness and death altered the meaning of tiredness itself. Modern people often treat fatigue as temporary deviation from normal health. Medieval people may have experienced it more as a baseline condition punctuated by moments of strength, relief, or crisis. A person did not necessarily expect to feel fully restored. The body aged earlier under physical strain. Teeth failed. Vision dimmed. Joints stiffened. Minor infections lingered dangerously. Pain accompanied ordinary existence more closely than many modern viewers realize. And sleep itself could become frightening. Night in the Middle Ages carried psychological weight that is difficult to fully recover today. Darkness was thicker. Beyond candlelight or hearth glow, the world disappeared quickly. Religious belief, folklore, and practical danger all shaped the imagination of nighttime. Spirits, demons, thieves, wolves, sudden death, divine judgment. These were not abstract literary decorations. They existed inside the emotional atmosphere of the age. A person waking suddenly in darkness after a nightmare might not calmly dismiss it as meaningless brain activity. Dreams could carry spiritual significance. Illness arriving in the night might worsen rapidly without effective treatment. A strange sound outside could signal danger. Fire spreading unnoticed through timber structures could destroy entire neighborhoods before dawn. So even rest contained alertness. This is one reason historians increasingly caution against romanticizing pre-modern sleep as naturally peaceful. Medieval nights were slower and darker, yes, but also more vulnerable. The sleeping body remained exposed to cold, disease, noise, fear, insects, animals, and uncertainty. And then there were the seasons of catastrophe, when ordinary tiredness deepened into something harsher. A failed harvest transformed fatigue. Hunger changes sleep in complicated ways. Some people sleep heavily from weakness. Others sleep badly from gnawing emptiness. In famine conditions, bodies lose resilience. Illness spreads more easily. Labor becomes harder precisely when more effort is required to survive. The emotional exhaustion of watching stores diminish week by week can be as punishing as physical labor itself. During plague outbreaks, another form of fatigue appeared, the exhaustion of constant fear and caregiving. The Black Death, beginning in the mid-14th century, shattered assumptions about ordinary life across much of Europe. Entire households became sick within days. Priests, physicians, family members, and caretakers moved from bed to bed with little understanding of transmission and little ability to stop the disease. Sleep became fragmented by terror, bells, funerals, and the sight of bodies accumulating faster than communities could bury them. What must it have felt like to lie awake hearing carts moving through narrow streets before dawn, carrying the dead? Or to wake already tired because grief itself had become physically heavy. One of the quieter truths about medieval exhaustion is that emotional strain constantly became bodily strain. There was little separation between psychological pressure and physical fatigue. Anxiety lived in muscles, stomachs, lungs, and sleep patterns long before modern terminology existed for stress hormones or trauma responses. A peasant awaiting tax collection after a poor harvest did not need modern psychology to feel exhaustion. A mother caring for feverish children did not require scientific vocabulary to experience depletion. A monk fearing spiritual failure, a merchant anxious about debt, a soldier wading through cold, wet nights before battle, all carried burdens that shaped how the body rested or failed to rest. And medieval warfare produced its own distinct exhaustion. Campaigning armies marched enormous distances on foot, often carrying heavy equipment with irregular food supplies. Camps were cold, damp, crowded, and unsanitary. Sleep could be interrupted by watches, alarms, weather, disease, or fear of attack. Soldiers sometimes spent nights in armor or partially armored conditions depending on danger. Horses required care before men rested. Rain-soaked bedding. Fires failed. Boots rotted. Wounds became infected. Popular imagination often frames medieval warfare around moments of battle. But much of military life was waiting while tired. Waiting hungry. Waiting cold. Waiting wet. Waiting sick, waiting uncertain whether violence would arrive at dawn. And here again appears one of the great contradictions of medieval life. Endurance was admired partly because life required so much of it. Religious culture reinforced this in complex ways. Christianity did not simply glorify suffering indiscriminately, but endurance through hardship carried spiritual significance. Saints fasted. Pilgrims traveled painfully long distances. Monastics practiced discipline through interrupted sleep and labor. Ordinary people interpreted hardship within broader frameworks of sin, redemption, divine testing, and eternal reward. This could provide meaning, but it could also normalize exhaustion. If suffering possessed spiritual value, then fatigue might be endured rather than questioned. The weary body became not only economic necessity, but moral terrain. Pilgrimage offers a revealing example. Medieval pilgrims often traveled astonishing distances by foot across dangerous roads with limited supplies. The journeys were physically exhausting, but exhaustion itself could become part of the religious experience. Blistered feet, Hunger, rain, and sleepless nights reinforced the seriousness of devotion. Fatigue transformed into proof of sincerity. Yet not all tiredness carried dignity. Some forms were embarrassing. Snoring, sleeplessness, weakness, drunken exhaustion, inability to perform work, or oversleeping could become sources of ridicule or anxiety. Medieval literature occasionally contains comic scenes involving sleep, laziness, or bodily discomfort. Humor existed alongside hardship. People complained. They mocked each other's habits. They noticed who appeared lazy and who appeared industrious. This human familiarity matters. Medieval people were not solemn museum figures moving through permanent misery. They were observant, irritated, affectionate, competitive, exhausted human beings trying to manage ordinary life with the tools available to them. And some of those tools were surprisingly sophisticated. People understood that air quality mattered, even if they explained it differently. Physicians advised attention to diet, environment, sleep habits, and emotional moderation. Herbal remedies for sleep and calming existed. Baths were used more variably than modern myths suggest. Wealthier households experimented with comfort where possible through curtains, cushions, warming pans, and layered bedding. The medieval world was not ignorant of rest. It simply lacked many of the technologies that make modern recovery more reliable. Central heating, electric lighting, antibiotics, pain relief, modern mattresses, insulated housing, refrigeration, labor protections, nutritional science, sanitation systems, and effective treatment for chronic disease. And because those things were absent, small discomforts accumulated continuously. A poorly healed ankle changed years of labor. Tooth pain disrupted nights for months. Smoke irritated lungs every winter. Dampness entered bones and joints. Bedding slowly collected dirt and insects faster than it could be cleaned. Heavy manual work began in childhood and continued into old age if survival required it. Tiredness, then, was not usually one dramatic collapse. It was accumulation, and perhaps nowhere was that accumulation more visible than in the medieval body itself. Skeletal remains often reveal arthritis, spinal strain, worn joints, healed fractures, and repetitive labor injuries. Historians and archaeologists can sometimes see exhaustion written directly into bone. A miller's shoulder, a farmer's spine, a laborer's knees. The body remembered work long after the workday ended. But there was another side to this story beginning to emerge by the later Middle Ages, especially in growing towns and commercial centers. Slowly, unevenly, certain people began gaining slightly more control over time itself. Mechanical clocks appeared in urban spaces. Work rhythms became more measurable. Trade expanded. Literacy grew among some classes. New patterns of labor and sleep began forming around commerce rather than purely daylight or agricultural necessity. And with that subtle transformation came an entirely new relationship with fatigue, one that would eventually reshape Europe far beyond the medieval world itself. For most of the Middle Ages, time had been experienced as something fluid and environmental. Dawn mattered more than precise minutes. Bells divided the day into meaningful intervals, but ordinary people often lived by sunlight, weather, hunger, and obligation rather than by exact numerical schedules. A task was completed when it was done. A journey lasted as long as conditions allowed. Nightfall imposed its own limits. But as towns expanded and trade networks thickened in the later medieval centuries, especially from the 13th century onward, certain communities began to measure time more rigidly. Public clocks appeared in prosperous urban centers. Merchants needed coordination. Workshops needed discipline. Markets depended on predictable rhythms. Gradually, the experience of tiredness began shifting from seasonal exhaustion towards something more regulated by hours themselves. This did not happen all at once, and it did not affect everyone equally. A peasant in an isolated rural village still lived very differently from a cloth merchant in Florence or a guild apprentice in London. Yet something important was changing beneath the surface. The body was becoming increasingly accountable to the clock. And strangely, this did not necessarily make people feel more rested. In fact, one of the quieter ironies of European history is that improvements in organization often created new forms of pressure. As commercial life expanded, some workers found themselves tied to stricter expectations. Workshops operated according to schedules. Apprenticeship systems imposed discipline on young bodies. Urban productivity depended on regularity. Bells no longer merely marked prayer or communal gathering. They increasingly structured labor. The medieval town, then, became an early experiment in controlled tiredness. A textile worker in a growing cloth-producing center might spend long hours bent over repetitive tasks in dim indoor conditions. Candlelight extended working possibilities beyond daylight, but at a cost. Ice strained, air thickened, sleep shortened. The ability to work later into the evening did not automatically create leisure. Often it simply extended obligation. And here another misconception begins to dissolve. Technological improvement does not always reduce exhaustion immediately. Sometimes it reorganizes exhaustion instead. Watermills and windmills, for example, eased certain forms of grinding labor. Better agricultural tools improved some efficiencies. Expanding trade increased access to goods in prosperous regions. Yet economic growth also intensified competition, taxation, and expectations. More commerce could mean more opportunity, but also more pressure to produce. A medieval artisan might feel fatigue differently from a field laborer, but not necessarily less intensely. The body still paid a price for repetitive strain, poor lighting, long concentration, and unstable economic conditions. A shoemaker hunched over leather in winter darkness could finish the day just as depleted as a farmer returning from muddy fields. And urban life introduced something else: social comparison. In small agricultural communities, inequality certainly existed, often brutally. But growing towns made wealth visibly present in new ways. Fine fabrics, imported spices, decorated homes, goldsmiths' work, and elaborate feasts displayed status openly. The poor could see prosperity more directly. Aspiration itself became tiring. A merchant might push himself harder not simply to survive, but to advance. A guild apprentice might endure exhaustion because mastery promised future independence. Ambition began intertwining with fatigue in increasingly recognizable ways. This is one of the moments where medieval tiredness starts to feel unexpectedly modern. Not fully modern, of course. The material conditions remained profoundly different. But the emotional structure begins to shift. Fatigue was no longer only the burden of surviving nature, harvests, and winter. It increasingly became tied to economic striving, urban discipline, and social mobility. And still, the body remained fragile. The later medieval centuries were filled with cycles of disease, instability, and environmental difficulty. Climate fluctuations associated with what historians often call the Little Ice Age brought colder and wetter conditions to parts of Europe beginning in the later Middle Ages. Harvests became less predictable in some regions. Storms intensified. Long wet seasons damaged crops and spread misery through already vulnerable populations. Cold exhaustion is difficult for modern people to fully imagine because modern heating shields us from it so effectively. But prolonged cold changes the texture of daily life. Muscles stiffen. Sleep becomes shallow. Damp clothing never fully dries. Hands crack. Bones ache. Work outdoors drains energy rapidly. Indoors, smoke thickens as fires burn longer. Nutrition becomes even more important precisely when food may be less reliable. Winter fatigue in a medieval northern town or village was not merely inconvenience, could feel endless, and because artificial light remained limited, darkness stretched psychologically as well as physically. Evening narrowed human activity. Long winter nights could intensify melancholy, anxiety, and isolation. Religious festivals helped punctuate the season with warmth and communal structure, but for many households winter remained a test of endurance. It is perhaps no accident that medieval culture developed such rich traditions around feast days, communal gatherings, storytelling, music, and ritual observance. These were not simply entertainments floating above ordinary life. They were forms of emotional survival inside physically demanding environments. A feast mattered more when daily food was monotonous. Candlelight mattered more when darkness dominated. Music mattered more when labor consumed most waking hours. Human beings sought relief where they could find it. Alcohol occupied an important place within this world of fatigue as well. Ale and wine were common parts of medieval diets in many regions, though their strength and quality varied widely. Drinking was social, practical, nutritional, and sometimes safer than questionable water supplies. But alcohol also shaped sleep in complicated ways. It could provide warmth, relaxation, and temporary relief while also worsening rest, impairing recovery, and deepening certain cycles of exhaustion. Again, medieval people understood parts of this experientially even if they lacked modern biochemical language. They knew drunkenness could damage judgment and discipline. They knew some habits left the body sluggish. Medical texts often discussed moderation carefully. But in hard conditions, immediate comfort frequently outweighed distant health consequences. And fatigue itself could drive people toward whatever brief relief was available. There is another detail here that modern audiences often underestimate: noise. The Middle Ages were not industrially loud, but they were rarely silent. Animals, bells, workshops, carts, marketplaces, churches, blacksmiths, dogs, crowds, storms, babies, arguments, taverns, and communal sleeping arrangements created constant interruption. Privacy was limited not only physically, but acoustically. Many people spent much of their lives surrounded by others. This shaped sleep profoundly. Modern sleep culture often assumes quiet darkness and personal space as normal conditions. Medieval sleepers usually had far less control. A traveler at an inn might share space with strangers who snored, coughed, argued, drank late, or rose before dawn. Servants slept near employers. Apprentices slept near workshops. Families slept together. Even monasteries, for all their discipline, contained communal rhythms of movement and sound. The idea of uninterrupted solitary sleep in a carefully climate-controlled room would have seemed unimaginably luxurious to most people. And yet, there is another reversal hidden here. Some historians argue that medieval people may also have possessed certain protections against exhaustion that modern societies sometimes lose. Their lives, while harsh, often contained clearer communal rhythms. Religious calendars structured rest and meaning. Work and home were less sharply separated. Extended families and village networks could provide forms of support. Natural daylight still regulated many bodily rhythms more consistently than modern artificial lighting. This does not mean medieval life was healthier overall. In most measurable physical terms, it was far more dangerous. But it reminds us that exhaustion is not caused by one thing alone. Human beings can endure enormous labor if other forms of stability exist. Conversely, even materially comfortable societies can produce deep fatigue through anxiety, isolation, and relentless psychological pressure. The medieval world had its own versions of those pressures. Honor mattered. Reputation mattered. Religious obligation mattered. Social failure carried consequences. Shame could be public and enduring. A poor harvest might not simply threaten income, but standing within the community. Marriage negotiations, inheritance disputes, guild conflicts, debt obligations, and local rivalries all produced emotional strain. And unlike modern bureaucratic systems, many medieval relationships were intensely personal. Justice, protection, employment, and opportunity often depended on networks of loyalty, patronage, and reputation. To lose favor with a lord, guild master, or local authority could be devastating. Stress lived close to the skin. This becomes particularly visible in the lives of servants and apprentices. A young apprentice in a medieval town did not merely work for wages. He often lived inside the household of his master, under constant supervision. His sleep, food, movement, and social life were regulated. Punishments could be physical. Expectations were strict. Success required endurance not only of labor, but of hierarchy itself. Servants in elite households faced similar pressures. Large noble or ecclesiastical households operated through enormous quantities of invisible labor. Cooking, cleaning, carrying water, laundering, caring for animals, preparing fires, transporting goods, serving meals, maintaining clothing, and managing storage. Much of this work began before sunrise and ended after dark. And because elite culture valued display, servants often worked hardest to maintain appearances they themselves could never enjoy. Candlelit feasts, embroidered garments, polished silver, warm chambers. These comforts rested on tired bodies moving constantly in the background. There is something deeply revealing about this. Medieval luxury did not eliminate exhaustion, it transferred it. The fatigue of the lower classes often became the visible comfort of the upper classes. And still, even the privileged remained vulnerable to one universal medieval reality: illness without reliable cure. Sleep in the Middle Ages was frequently interrupted by pain. Toothaches alone could become unbearable. A decayed tooth might throb for weeks or months, worsening at night when the body became still. Joint pain from labor or age could intensify in cold weather. Fevers arrived unpredictably. Skin diseases irritated constantly. Parasites disrupted digestion and energy. Many conditions modern medicine resolves quickly lingered indefinitely. This meant people often learned to function while partially unwell. A medieval person might wake exhausted not because they had worked too hard yesterday, but because they had not experienced a fully healthy body in years. Chronic discomfort blended into ordinary life so completely that it ceased to stand out individually. And there was another exhausting force threaded quietly through all levels of society: uncertainty. Modern states, for all their flaws, provide many invisible stabilizers: standardized currency, police systems, widespread literacy, medical infrastructure, insurance, regulated food systems, rapid communication. Medieval people lived with far fewer guarantees. Harvests failed. Lords changed. Wars moved unexpectedly across regions. Roads became unsafe. Disease emerged suddenly. Fire destroyed neighborhoods within hours. The future often felt physically unstable. That instability shaped sleep. A merchant awaiting news from distant trade routes, a farmer fearing hail before harvest, a widow uncertain about legal protections, a monk worried about famine, a sailor watching weather patterns, all carried forms of vigilance into the night. And vigilance is tiring even when danger never arrives. By the late medieval period, Europe was becoming more interconnected, more commercially active, more urban, and in some regions more intellectually dynamic. Universities expanded. Literacy widened slowly beyond clergy. Trade routes linked distant worlds. Ideas moved more rapidly. Wealth accumulated unevenly. But the medieval body remained stubbornly human inside all these changes. People still woke stiff from cold. They still feared illness in the dark. They still lay awake listening to storms batter timber walls or wondering whether food would last until spring. They still buried children. They still worked through pain because stopping was impossible. And as Europe edged gradually toward the early modern world, one question began pressing more insistently beneath the surface of daily life. If time could now be measured more precisely, controlled more carefully, and sold more efficiently than before, then who exactly owned a tired person's hours? For much of the medieval period, labor had certainly been demanded by lords, churches, households, and survival itself, but time still retained a kind of rough organic elasticity. Weather interrupted plans. Darkness halted activity. Feast days punctuated obligation. Illness slowed entire communities. The natural world continued imposing boundaries on productivity. But as commercial life deepened in the later medieval centuries, especially in wealthier urban regions, human beings began pushing against those older limits more deliberately. And nowhere was this more visible than in the changing relationship between sleep and artificial light. A single candle seems insignificant to modern eyes. Yet in medieval Europe, light after dark carried economic meaning. Beeswax candles were expensive and often associated with churches, wealthy households, and ceremonial spaces. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper but smoky and unpleasant. Oil lamps existed in some regions and contexts, but fuel itself had costs. To remain awake after sunset required resources. This meant that extending work into the night was never merely a personal choice. It reflected wealth, necessity, or institutional structure. Monasteries could sustain nighttime activity through organized routines and communal resources. Noble households illuminated halls for feasts or administration. Urban workshops sometimes pushed labor later during busy periods. Scribes copied manuscripts by artificial light despite eye strain and fatigue. And the body paid attention to all of it. Modern science would later explain circadian rhythms, hormonal cycles, and the physiological importance of darkness. Medieval people lacked that vocabulary, but they still experienced the consequences physically. Eyes burned. Sleep became uneven. Mental clarity declined. Candlelight allowed work to continue while subtly separating human rhythms from the older authority of daylight. This was not yet the fully illuminated world of factories and electric cities, but the direction of change had begun. And there is something deeply revealing about how medieval writers discussed nighttime wakefulness. Sleeplessness was often treated not simply as inconvenience, but as disturbance of moral, bodily, and spiritual order. A healthy person was expected to rest appropriately. Too much sleep suggested sloth. Too little suggested imbalance, anxiety, illness, excessive study, sin, or emotional disturbance. Medical texts inherited from ancient traditions frequently emphasized moderation. Sleep was considered necessary for restoring the body's internal balance. Physicians advised attention to sleeping environments, digestion, emotional state, and bodily regimen. Heavy meals late at night could be discouraged. Certain sleeping positions were recommended. Air quality mattered. Excessive worry was believed to damage health. In other words, medieval people understood that exhaustion could slowly unravel a person, even if they explained the mechanisms differently from modern medicine. And this awareness becomes especially poignant when we look at scholars. The medieval scholar lived in a strangely contradictory position. Education carried prestige, especially within religious and administrative structures, but intellectual labor was also physically punishing. Reading manuscripts required intense concentration under imperfect conditions. Libraries were cold. Ink froze in winter. Candlelight strained vision. Long hours bent over texts damaged posture and joints. Students at medieval universities often lived in cramped quarters with poor diets and little comfort. Many were young men far from home, navigating financial insecurity, academic pressure, disease outbreaks, and urban violence. University towns could be chaotic places filled with taverns, rivalries, crowded housing, and periodic unrest. The exhausted medieval student, surprisingly enough, is not difficult to recognize across the centuries. Some complained about poor sleep. Some struggled with hunger. Some worked through illness because education represented one of the few available paths upward. Academic life was intellectually exciting, but physically draining. And because medieval medicine linked mind and body closely together, excessive study itself could be viewed as dangerous if it depleted vitality too severely. Too much reading, too much concentration, too much nighttime wakefulness, these were believed capable of weakening health. There was wisdom hidden in that fear. The medieval world constantly reminded people that the body had limits, even when society demanded those limits be ignored. Travel offers another revealing window into medieval exhaustion because movement through the medieval landscape was almost always slower, harsher, and more uncertain than modern imagination first assumes. Roads varied enormously in quality. Some Roman routes remained partially usable, but many pathways became muddy, flooded, frozen, or deeply rutted depending on season and region. Travelers walked long distances in poor footwear. Horses tired. Wagons broke. Bridges failed. Inns were inconsistent. Banditry remained a concern in some areas. A merchant on the road rarely experienced travel as leisure. Even pilgrimage, often spiritually meaningful, involved profound physical discomfort. Rain-soaked clothing that might not fully dry for days. Feet blistered. Food spoiled. Sleeping arrangements varied from crowded inns to monastery guesthouses to open-air shelter. And perhaps most exhausting of all was uncertainty itself. A traveler rarely knew exactly when they would arrive, what conditions awaited them, or whether roads ahead were safe. Delays were normal. Storms changed plans. River crossings became dangerous after heavy rain. Winter travel could become deadly. This constant negotiation with unpredictability shaped the medieval nervous system in subtle ways. The body remained alert because circumstances genuinely changed quickly. Even ordinary communication moved at the speed of physical exhaustion. News traveled through tired horses, tired messengers, tired sailors, tired merchants. A letter represented labor. Information itself moved through bodies. And while elite chroniclers often focused on kings, wars, and religious disputes, ordinary tiredness continued quietly beneath every layer of medieval society. Bakers rose before dawn because bread had to be ready early. Millers worked according to water flow and demand. Fishermen adapted to tides and weather. Shepherds guarded animals through cold nights. Midwives were summoned unpredictably. Blacksmiths hammered through heat and smoke. The medieval economy rested not on abstract systems, but on human endurance repeated daily. This becomes especially visible when we think about water. Modern people rarely spend much energy physically obtaining water. Medieval people often did. Water had to be carried, drawn, hauled, heated, stored, and protected from contamination. In towns, access varied enormously. In rural areas, wells, streams, or communal sources demanded regular labor. A medieval woman carrying water repeatedly across uneven ground was expending energy modern infrastructure quietly saves for us every single day. The same was true for fuel. Firewood had to be gathered, chopped, transported, dried, rationed, and maintained. Heat itself required labor before it could become comfort. And because so many survival tasks depended directly on human muscle, even small injuries became exhausting complications. A strained back altered every movement. A damaged hand threatened productivity. A bad knee made carrying water agonizing. Medieval people often continued working through injuries that modern societies might temporarily excuse or medically treat. Rest was not always economically possible. This is one reason skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries often reveal astonishing evidence of wear. Archaeologists find compressed vertebrae, repetitive stress injuries, badly healed fractures, arthritic joints, and signs of chronic labor etched into bone itself. The medieval body was not merely occasionally tired. It was frequently worn. And yet there is another subtle twist here. Despite these hardships, medieval people sometimes slept more flexibly than modern industrial workers later would. Because artificial lighting remained limited for most households, darkness still enforced periods of inactivity. Seasonal variation mattered deeply. Winter nights could become long stretches of partial rest, storytelling, mending, prayer, intimacy, or fragmented sleep. In contrast, later industrial societies would increasingly compress human rhythms into fixed schedules independent of season or sunlight. Medieval fatigue could be brutal, but it often remained tied to environmental cycles. The industrial future waiting beyond the medieval horizon would demand something different: consistency. The seeds of that future were already visible in certain late medieval industries. Textile production, especially in prosperous commercial regions, began organizing labor with increasing intensity. Guild systems regulated work, quality, apprenticeship, and production schedules. Urban workshops concentrated labor into denser environments. Merchants sought predictability. Contracts required deadlines. The body slowly became something that could be synchronized economically. This transformation was uneven and incomplete, but its psychological implications were enormous. Time itself became monetized more aggressively. Delays acquired financial consequences. Tiredness became not only suffering, but inefficiency. And once exhaustion becomes economically measurable, societies begin treating it differently. A peasant too tired to work endangered survival locally. A wage laborer too tired to produce threatened commercial output. Those are related but distinct systems of pressure. Medieval Europe never fully became a wage labor society in the modern sense, but by the 15th century, parts of urban life were clearly moving toward more commercialized relationships between time, labor, and money. At the same moment, another fascinating contradiction emerged among elites. The performance of leisure itself could become exhausting. Court life required endless ritual attention. Nobles traveled between obligations, attended ceremonies, negotiated marriages, supervised estates, entertained guests, hunted, governed, and navigated fragile political alliances. Clothing itself could be physically burdensome. Layered garments, heavy fabrics, restrictive tailoring, ceremonial armor, elaborate hairstyles. Sleep in noble environments was not necessarily private or peaceful either. Servants moved through chambers constantly. Security concerns remained real. Illness spread rapidly through courts. Political anxiety could linger long after candles were extinguished. Some kings reportedly slept poorly for years under the weight of governance, rebellion, or war. Chronic stress is not a modern invention, and medieval warfare intensified this dramatically. A castle under siege became an environment of continuous exhaustion. Defenders repaired walls, rationed food, watched for attack, extinguished fires, treated wounds, and endured relentless uncertainty. Sleep happened in fragments. Fear remained close. Disease spread easily in confined conditions. Attackers suffered differently but no less severely. Siege camps were breeding grounds for dysentery, exposure, infection, and hunger. Soldiers dug trenches, hauled siege equipment, maintained watches, and survived in mud for months at a time. The romantic image of medieval warfare often focuses on banners and cavalry charges, but most military fatigue looked far less dramatic. It looked like standing guard in freezing rain. It looked like infected feet. It looked like trying to sleep while hungry beside men coughing through the night. And medieval chroniclers occasionally reveal this reality almost accidentally. Beneath descriptions of heroism appear small details. Soldiers collapsing from hunger, monks too tired to continue prayers properly, travelers falling asleep beside roads, workers slowing during famine years, mothers weakened after repeated childbirths. The ordinary exhaustion of ordinary people rarely announced itself loudly in records. Historians must often notice it indirectly. Sometimes it appears in laws regulating labor hours. Sometimes in medical advice warning against overexertion. Sometimes in complaints about servants oversleeping or workers failing to appear. Sometimes in monastic rules attempting to balance discipline with bodily limitation. Even saints, supposedly models of spiritual endurance, occasionally reveal the physical limits of exhaustion. Accounts of ascetics fasting severely or depriving themselves of sleep often describe bodies weakening dramatically. Holiness itself could become physically consuming, and medieval audiences noticed that tension. They admired endurance while also fearing bodily collapse. This balance between admiration and anxiety may be one of the deepest truths about medieval tiredness. Fatigue was expected, but excessive fatigue threatened social order. A body that could no longer function endangered households, monasteries, armies, workshops, and fields alike, which meant medieval society developed countless small strategies for managing exhaustion even when it could not eliminate it entirely. People napped opportunistically. Seasonal rhythms shifted workloads. Religious calendars inserted pauses. Ale provided calories and temporary relief. Communal labor distributed tasks. Storytelling softened long evenings. Shared beds conserved warmth. Herbal remedies attempted to calm minds or induce sleep. None of these erased hardship, but together they formed a culture of endurance. And as the medieval world moved gradually toward the 16th century, that culture was about to encounter forces even more demanding than cold winters, poor harvests, or interrupted nights. Expanding trade, early capitalism, overseas exploration, state centralization, and eventually industrialization would transform tiredness from a mostly local and seasonal burden into something increasingly standardized, disciplined, and continuous. But before that transformation fully arrived, Europe would pass through one more deeply exhausting threshold. A world of religious upheaval, expanding cities, recurring disease, and mounting social pressure in which old rhythms of sleep and labor were already beginning to fracture. The transition was not dramatic at first. Most people did not wake one morning realizing they had entered a new era of tiredness. Change arrived unevenly, region by region, household by household. Yet across the 15th and 16th centuries, subtle shifts accumulated inside ordinary life. Cities grew larger. Trade accelerated. Governments demanded more taxes, more records, more administration. Religious conflict unsettled communities that had once understood the world through more stable rhythms of ritual and tradition. Printing spread information faster than medieval Europe had ever experienced before. Roads became busier. Ports became louder. Markets became more competitive. And beneath all of this, human beings still needed sleep. One of the strange tensions of the early modern transition is that expanding opportunity often arrived alongside expanding exhaustion. Prosperous regions generated wealth, but wealth created expectation. Merchants extended networks farther across Europe and beyond. Letters traveled continuously. Ships departed according to commercial schedules. Financial risk intensified. Urban craftsmen competed harder. Apprentices worked longer to secure advancement. The older medieval relationship between daylight and activity did not disappear, but it weakened. Candles became more available in some places. Oil lamps improved. Wealthier urban homes extended evening activity more confidently. Taverns remained active after sunset. Workshops occasionally continued late into darkness. Reading after nightfall became increasingly common among literate classes despite the physical strain. And there was another development quietly reshaping the body: caffeine. Coffee would not become widespread in Europe until later centuries, but stimulating drinks and medicinal tonics already occupied an important place in attempts to manage energy and wakefulness. Medieval and early modern people constantly searched for ways to regulate the body's rhythms. Herbal infusions, wine mixtures, spice drinks, and medicinal compounds were all used to calm, stimulate, warm, purge, or restore. This desire to manipulate fatigue reveals something important. People did not simply accept exhaustion passively. They negotiated with it. They experimented against it. And nowhere was this negotiation more visible than among workers whose livelihoods depended on precision. Consider the scribes and printers emerging in growing urban centers. Before printing, manuscript copying had already strained eyes, backs, and attention spans. But the printing revolution accelerated intellectual labor dramatically. Workshops producing books became environments of intense repetitive effort. Typesetters handled tiny metal letters for long hours under imperfect light. Printers managed heavy presses, ink, paper supplies, deadlines, and financial risk. Information itself was becoming physically exhausting to produce. There is something almost modern in that image. Tired workers staying awake late into the night so that knowledge, commerce, religion, and politics could move faster. And move faster they did. The Reformation shattered religious unity across much of Europe beginning in the 16th century, and religious conflict brought its own exhausting atmosphere. Communities divided, sermons intensified, authorities demanded loyalty, pamphlets circulated rapidly. Fear spread through rumor and preaching alike. The emotional certainty that had once structured much of medieval life became less stable in many regions. For ordinary people, this uncertainty often translated into bodily strain. Imagine lying awake at night wondering whether your neighbors remained loyal to the same faith. Imagine hearing distant reports of persecution, rebellion, icon destruction, or war. Imagine trying to preserve household stability while the moral structure of society itself seemed contested. The human nervous system responds powerfully to prolonged uncertainty, whether in the Middle Ages or today. Sleep becomes lighter, thoughts circle, bodies remain tense, and early modern Europe produced uncertainty in abundance. Climate instability continued affecting harvests. Disease outbreaks persisted. Inflation disrupted livelihoods in some regions as expanding trade altered local economies. Rural populations migrated toward cities seeking opportunity, often finding overcrowding instead. Urban overcrowding deserves particular attention because it transformed tiredness into something more concentrated. A medieval village could be exhausting, but it still existed within open landscapes and agricultural rhythms. Expanding cities compressed bodies together more tightly. Housing became crowded. Air quality worsened. Noise intensified. Waste accumulated. Privacy diminished further. A laborer in a 16th century city might sleep in a room shared with several unrelated workers, breathing stale air after long days of manual effort. Windows remained small in many buildings. Bedding was reused constantly. Vermin thrived. Disease moved rapidly through dense neighborhoods. And unlike rural labor, urban work often lacked seasonal breathing spaces. A dockworker, porter, butcher, brewer, laundress, or market carrier could find labor continuing relentlessly regardless of weather or agricultural cycles. Cities developed their own tempo, one driven less by harvest and more by continuous exchange. This shift mattered profoundly because it changed how fatigue accumulated. Agricultural exhaustion often arrived in waves tied to seasons. Urban exhaustion increasingly became repetitive and ongoing. The same body movements repeated daily. The same noise persisted nightly. The same polluted air entered the lungs continuously. And still, many people came willingly. Cities offered possibilities unavailable in rural life. Wages, guild membership, trade, anonymity, education, social mobility. Yet those possibilities demanded endurance. A young migrant arriving in London, Paris, Venice, or Antwerp entered a world where opportunity and exhaustion were closely intertwined. The body became a kind of economic instrument, rented out day after day. This did not yet resemble the fully industrialized labor systems of the 19th century, but the foundations were forming. Human time was becoming increasingly measurable, exchangeable, and valuable. And as that happened, sleep itself slowly began losing status as communal rhythm and becoming something more private, more disciplined, and sometimes more morally charged. In medieval households, segmented sleep and communal sleeping arrangements had often been accepted as ordinary realities. But by the early modern period, especially among wealthier classes, ideas about orderly domestic life began changing. Bedrooms became more distinct spaces in elite homes. Privacy gained prestige. Manuals on behavior and household management increasingly emphasized discipline, moderation, and self-control. A proper household was expected to regulate itself carefully. This included regulating bodies. The disciplined body rose appropriately, worked appropriately, prayed appropriately, and rested appropriately. Sleep was still necessary, but excessive sleeping increasingly attracted suspicion in commercial and Protestant cultures that valued industriousness intensely. This cultural transformation would eventually become enormous. One of the deepest historical shifts in European attitudes toward tiredness was the gradual moral elevation of constant productivity. Medieval society certainly valued labor, but religious calendars and environmental limits still interrupted work naturally. Early modern commercial culture increasingly praised relentless discipline itself. The tired person was no longer merely enduring hardship. They were proving usefulness. And yet the body continued resisting. Medical writings from the 16th and 17th centuries reveal ongoing concern about exhaustion, melancholy, disturbed sleep, and nervous strain. Physicians described people unable to rest properly, plagued by anxious thoughts, weakened by overwork or emotional distress. The language changed over time, but the human experience remained recognizable. Merchants worried about debt late into the night. Scholars exhausted themselves through study. Clerks copied records endlessly. Sailors crossed oceans under brutal conditions. Domestic servants worked until collapse. Women carried overlapping burdens of household labor, childcare, textile production, and emotional management. And increasingly, Europe's expanding global ambitions created new forms of fatigue altogether. Long-distance sea travel was physically punishing beyond what most modern people easily imagine. Sailors slept in cramped, damp quarters surrounded by disease, storms, poor nutrition, and constant danger. Voyages lasted months. Fresh water spoiled. Scurvy weakened bodies slowly and horribly. Sleep aboard ships was fragmented by watches, rough seas, and fear. The age of exploration depended on exhausted bodies moving through terrifying uncertainty. And those voyages connected Europe to expanding systems of trade that reshaped labor back home. Sugar, tobacco, spices, silver, and colonial goods altered economies and appetites. Commercial competition intensified. Wealth concentrated unevenly. Some people grew richer than medieval elites could have imagined. Many others simply worked harder within increasingly demanding systems. This is why the history of tiredness cannot be separated from the history of power. Exhaustion is never distributed equally. In every era, certain people rest because others cannot. A noble sleeping behind heavy curtains in a heated chamber depended on servants rising before dawn to maintain fires. A prosperous merchant relied on sailors crossing dangerous oceans without proper sleep. Urban comfort often rested on invisible labor performed elsewhere under harsher conditions. And early modern society became extraordinarily skilled at hiding that relationship. Luxury expanded, but so did distance from the labor supporting it. In medieval villages, labor remained visible. People saw who harvested grain, hauled water, repaired roofs, buried the dead, and tended animals. In larger commercial societies, the chain between comfort and exhaustion lengthened. Goods arrived from farther away. Labor became specialized. Wealth insulated some classes from the physical realities sustaining their lives. But the exhausted body remained present everywhere if one looked carefully enough. It appeared in servants falling asleep beside kitchen fires after midnight work, in apprentices developing bent spines before adulthood, in women weakened after repeated pregnancies, in sailors staggering ashore after months at sea, in miners coughing through sleepless nights, in scholars rubbing strained eyes beside candle stubs, and perhaps most hauntingly, it appeared in the growing gap between what society demanded from bodies and what bodies could naturally sustain. This gap widened further as clocks became more common. Public clocks had existed in important urban centers since the later Middle Ages, but by the 17th century, increasingly precise timekeeping spread more deeply into European life. Mechanical regularity carried psychological consequences. People became more conscious of lateness, schedules, and measurable productivity. Time itself began feeling scarce in new ways. This scarcity changed sleep profoundly. A peasant rising before dawn because harvest demanded it experienced exhaustion differently from a clerk forced into rigid daily schedules disconnected from seasonal rhythms. The first was constrained by nature, the second increasingly by systems. And systems can demand consistency even when the body weakens. This distinction matters because it marks the beginning of a transformation that still shapes modern exhaustion today. Medieval tiredness had often been collective, visible, environmental, and openly physical. Early modern tiredness became increasingly individualized and disciplined. A worker was expected to regulate himself. The language of self-control grew stronger across many parts of Europe. Industriousness became virtue. Idleness became moral failure. Rest itself sometimes required justification. At the same time, sleeping environments slowly changed for some social classes. Wealthier households invested more heavily in comfort. Improved mattresses, bed curtains for warmth and privacy, specialized bed furniture, dedicated bedrooms, finer linens. But even these improvements carried contradictions. Heavy bed curtains trapped warmth while also trapping stale air. Wealthier diets could improve nutrition while also producing new health problems. Private rooms reduced noise but increased isolation. Greater comfort did not automatically produce peace. And the poor remained excluded from most of these developments anyway. In crowded urban housing, sleep remained communal and precarious. Lodgers rented corners of rooms. Entire families shared beds. Noise passed easily through thin walls. Industrial-scale pollution had not yet fully arrived, but smoke, waste, and foul air already burdened many neighborhoods heavily. Meanwhile, another subtle but important shift was occurring in attitudes toward nighttime itself. The medieval night had long been understood as spiritually charged, dangerous, mysterious, and socially limited. But expanding urban life slowly domesticated parts of the night. Taverns, theaters, commercial districts, and better-lit streets in some cities extended activity further into darkness. Night became economically useful, and once night becomes economically useful, societies begin pressuring human beings to remain awake longer inside it. That pressure would only intensify in the centuries ahead. But already, by the edge of the early modern world, many people were living between two incompatible realities: the ancient biological rhythms inherited from agrarian life, and the growing commercial systems demanding greater regularity, wakefulness, and productivity. The result was a new kind of fatigue beginning to settle quietly across Europe, less seasonal perhaps, less openly communal, but in some ways even more difficult to escape. Because once exhaustion becomes internalized as personal responsibility, people begin blaming themselves for limits that older societies might have recognized as ordinary human weakness. A medieval peasant collapsing after harvest was visibly overwhelmed by physical conditions everyone understood. But the clerk unable to keep pace with expanding administrative demands, the merchant lying awake calculating debts, or the apprentice struggling under endless discipline increasingly faced a different kind of pressure. Their tiredness could appear personal, individual, moral. This shift did not happen suddenly, and it was never absolute. Rural Europe remained deeply agricultural for centuries. But gradually, particularly in commercial regions, the meaning of exhaustion changed from something openly shared to something increasingly managed in private. And this private management of fatigue created new habits. People experimented with sleeping arrangements more carefully. Wealthier households adopted separate chambers when possible. Beds themselves became status objects. Feather mattresses, linen sheets, curtains, warming pans, and upholstered furniture signaled refinement. Comfort slowly became associated not merely with survival, but with identity. Yet here again, appearances concealed contradiction. Some elite beds were enormous, elaborately carved, heavily curtained, and visually impressive, but not necessarily ideal for restful sleep. Curtains trapped warmth during winter, but they also trapped stale air and odors. Heavy fabrics gathered dust and insects. Bedrooms could remain poorly ventilated. Chamber pots sat nearby overnight. Fires consumed oxygen while filling rooms with smoke particles. A nobleman sleeping in luxury might still wake coughing. And while elite households invested in comfort, ordinary people continued sleeping in crowded conditions that made true rest difficult. In many urban districts, several families occupied single structures divided crudely by partitions or shared lofts. Lodgers rented floor space. Workshops and living quarters merged together. A shoemaker's bench might sit only a few feet from where children slept. The modern separation between workplace and sleeping place remained incomplete. This mattered enormously because the body never fully escaped labor. The smell of work followed people into bed. Tanneries saturated neighborhoods with foul odors. Blacksmiths carried smoke and sweat home on their clothing. Bakers rose at impossible hours. Brewers worked through the night. Servants remained on call. Even dreams, one suspects, must have been shaped by labor's persistence. And while the wealthy could sometimes shield themselves from physical exhaustion, they could not entirely shield themselves from anxiety. In fact, the expanding complexity of early modern society may have increased certain forms of mental strain among literate and commercial classes. Letters had to be answered, contracts honored, loans repaid, ships tracked across uncertain oceans, political alliances monitored carefully, religious loyalties navigated cautiously. News traveled faster than before, but still slowly enough to leave long periods of uncertainty. A merchant in Antwerp or Venice might spend weeks awaiting word about a delayed cargo while financial obligations accumulated relentlessly. Sleep under those conditions becomes fragile. Historians occasionally uncover traces of this emotional exhaustion in personal letters and diaries. Complaints of sleeplessness, nervous weakness, troubled thoughts, headaches, digestive problems, and melancholy appear with increasing frequency in some early modern writings. The language varies, but the underlying experience feels familiar. The mind refused to rest because the world no longer rested easily. And meanwhile, Europe's growing dependence on clocks continued altering daily rhythms. By the 17th century, urban bells and mechanical timekeeping structured ordinary life more deeply than many medieval communities would have recognized. Markets opened according to fixed schedules. Courts met at designated hours. Workshops organized labor more tightly. Transport systems, primitive though they still were, required coordination. Time became external authority. One of the most subtle but profound changes in human history occurs when people stop primarily asking whether a task is complete and start asking what time it is. That transformation changes the body. A worker compelled awake by daylight and harvest feels fatigue differently from a worker compelled awake by abstract schedules independent of weather or season. The first body negotiates with nature. The second negotiates increasingly with systems designed by other human beings. And systems rarely care whether someone slept well. This was especially true for servants. Large households in the 17th and 18th centuries depended on armies of domestic workers whose exhaustion remained mostly invisible to elite society. Maids rose before dawn to light fires in cold rooms before employers awakened. Kitchen staff worked long after formal meals ended. Laundresses handled brutally physical labor involving water, heat, lifting, scrubbing, and endless repetition. The laundry alone could be exhausting beyond modern imagination. Without electric machines, running water, or chemical detergents, washing clothing required hauling water, heating it manually, scrubbing fabric intensely, wringing heavy wet cloth, carrying loads, drying garments carefully, ironing with heated implements, and repeating the process constantly. Wealthy households consumed enormous quantities of linen and clothing precisely because servants handled the labor invisibly. The polished appearance of elite life rested on tired female bodies working in heat and steam behind closed doors. And domestic service carried another burden besides physical fatigue: interrupted sleep. Servants often slept lightly because they could be summoned at any hour. A bell ringing in the night might require immediate attention. Fires needed maintaining. Sick children required care. Travelers arrived late. Guests demanded service unpredictably. To sleep deeply while serving others could itself become dangerous. This constant vigilance produced a peculiar exhaustion familiar to many caregivers across history. The body learns not to fully relax because interruption is always possible. Mothers experience something similar, of course, though often with even fewer opportunities for recovery. Across both medieval and early modern societies, women's tiredness remained structurally embedded inside domestic expectation. Pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, childcare, food preparation, textile work, emotional management, and household coordination overlapped continuously. One of the reasons historical exhaustion is difficult to fully measure is that much of the most relentless labor happened privately inside homes rather than publicly in records. A woman waking several times each night to care for children while maintaining household production during the day might appear nowhere in political chronicles or commercial accounts. Yet her fatigue shaped the survival of entire families. And unlike modern societies with artificial infant feeding, refrigeration, disposable materials, or labor-saving appliances, early modern domestic life required near-constant physical involvement. Fires could not simply be switched on. Food preservation demanded vigilance. Clothing required endless repair. Illness demanded hands-on care. The household itself was a workplace. And increasingly, especially in growing urban regions, households also became sites of small-scale production. Spinning, weaving, sewing, candlemaking, brewing, and countless other tasks filled evenings after daylight labor ended. Candlelight extended productivity while quietly stealing rest. There is a particularly revealing irony here. Technological improvements often arrived first not as ways to reduce work, but as ways to increase how much work could be extracted from waking hours. Better lighting allowed longer labor. Improved transport enabled larger markets requiring more coordination. More precise clocks intensified discipline. Expanding literacy increased paperwork. Commercial growth generated accounting demands. Human beings repeatedly used innovation to outpace their own recovery. And nowhere was this clearer than aboard ships during Europe's expanding maritime age. Sailors in the 17th and 18th centuries lived under exhausting systems of watch schedules that ignored natural sleep rhythms almost entirely. Crews rotated through fixed periods of labor and rest regardless of weather, darkness, or bodily need. Storms erased sleep altogether. Hammocks swung violently. Saltwater soaked bedding. Disease spread quickly through cramped quarters. The ocean created fatigue not only through labor, but through constant instability. The body never stopped adjusting to movement. And because maritime trade became increasingly central to European economies, exhausted sailors effectively powered global commerce. Sugar, tea, coffee, tobacco, textiles, and colonial wealth moved through sleepless systems sustained by human endurance. Tea and coffee themselves deserve attention because they gradually transformed European relationships with wakefulness. By the 18th century, coffee houses spread through many cities as centers of business, news, and intellectual exchange. Coffee and tea allowed people to remain alert longer and work later. Merchants, writers, officials, scholars, and traders increasingly depended on stimulants that sharpened attention while quietly distancing the body from older rhythms of fatigue. This was revolutionary. For most of human history, tiredness imposed relatively hard limits. Darkness and exhaustion forced slowing. But stimulants began weakening those boundaries. A person could now override sleepiness temporarily in service of work, study, commerce, or social life. The consequences would become enormous in later centuries. At first, however, these drinks often appeared civilized, refined, even healthy compared with heavy alcohol consumption. Coffee houses gained reputations as spaces of reasoned conversation and commercial seriousness. But beneath that intellectual energy was something simpler. Europe was learning how to remain awake longer. And staying awake longer changes societies. Even leisure shifted accordingly. Urban entertainment expanded. Theaters, taverns, salons, gambling houses, and nighttime social life became more active in some regions. Wealthier people increasingly treated evening hours as usable social time rather than merely transitional darkness before sleep. Night slowly became colonized. Street lighting in major cities accelerated this process. Early systems were limited and uneven, but illuminated streets altered perceptions of danger, activity, and possibility after dark. Cities no longer surrendered fully to night in the same way medieval towns had. Yet while elites explored nighttime culture, the working poor often experienced night differently, as shortened recovery. A laborer sleeping fewer hours because noise, crowding, shift schedules, or urban activity disrupted rest rarely gained compensating comfort elsewhere. Industrialization had not fully arrived, but many bodies were already adapting uneasily to increasingly unnatural rhythms. And physicians began noticing. By the 18th century, medical discussions of nervous disorders, exhaustion, overstimulation, and mental strain became increasingly common among educated classes. Scholars debated the effects of excessive study, urban living, luxury, and emotional intensity. Melancholy acquired new cultural significance. Sleep disturbances attracted growing concern. It would be simplistic to project modern diagnoses backward directly, But something real was clearly happening. Faster communication, urban growth, expanding commerce, and intensified social expectations were affecting how people felt physically and emotionally. The body was struggling to keep pace with the accelerating world. And still, for vast numbers of ordinary people, older forms of exhaustion never disappeared at all. Rural labor remained brutally physical. Harvest still demanded relentless effort. Winters still drained energy. Illness still interrupted sleep painfully. Childbirth remained dangerous. Food insecurity persisted. Many people balanced old agrarian fatigue and new economic pressure simultaneously. This overlap is important because history rarely replaces one reality neatly with another. The exhausted agricultural laborer and the exhausted urban clerk could exist at the same moment, shaped by different systems yet sharing the same worn human limits. And by the 18th century, another transformation loomed on the horizon, one that would intensify nearly every trend already underway. Machines powered not by wind, water, or muscle alone, but increasingly by fossil fuel and industrial organization, were beginning to appear. Factories would soon gather bodies together under unprecedented discipline. Artificial lighting would grow stronger. Clocks would rule more absolutely. Sleep itself would become negotiable in entirely new ways. But before the industrial age fully remade human exhaustion, Europe still inhabited a strange in-between world, half medieval, half modern, carrying older biological rhythms into systems that were already beginning to ignore them. And perhaps nowhere was that tension more visible than in the first factories. Early industrial labor did not arrive as a clean break from the past. Many early factories borrowed older habits from workshops, mills, and domestic production. But they introduced something fundamentally different in scale and discipline. Water-powered textile mills in Britain and parts of continental Europe gathered workers into centralized spaces where labor could be supervised continuously and synchronized mechanically. For tired bodies, this changed almost everything. In agricultural life, exhaustion often rose and fell with natural conditions. Rain might halt work. Winter shortened activity. Illness slowed the household collectively. But factory labor demanded regularity independent of weather, daylight, or personal energy. Machines did not care whether workers slept badly, whether their joints hurt, or whether their children were sick. The clock became more important than the season. This shift may sound abstract at first, but its physical consequences were immediate. Workers now rose according to factory bells rather than dawn alone. Meals were shortened and regulated. Breaks became formalized. Time itself hardened. A person arriving late no longer merely inconvenienced a household or delayed a harvest task. They disrupted mechanical coordination and commercial output. And because factories concentrated labor densely, fatigue spread socially in new ways. Hundreds of workers inhaled the same dust, endured the same noise, and moved through the same exhausting routines together. The industrial world is often imagined as loud, and it certainly was. But before it was loud, it was tiring. The early textile mills of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were physically punishing environments. Cotton dust filled the air. Machines demanded repetitive motion for long hours. Ventilation was poor. Lighting was uneven. Children worked alongside adults because small hands could manage delicate tasks within dangerous machinery. Sleep under these conditions became something different from medieval rest entirely. For many workers, especially the poor, exhaustion no longer emerged mainly from seasonal labor or household survival tasks. It came from industrial schedules repeated relentlessly day after day. Fatigue lost some of its old irregularity and became continuous. And continuity matters deeply. The human body can survive astonishing bursts of labor when recovery follows. But industrial discipline often compressed recovery itself. Workers finished shifts too tired to meaningfully restore themselves before the next day began. Housing near factories was frequently overcrowded, dirty, noisy, and polluted. Urban smoke darkened skies. Water contamination spread disease. Streets remained active long after sunset. A factory worker might leave one exhausting environment only to enter another. There is a haunting detail repeated in many early industrial accounts. People falling asleep almost anywhere. Children slept beside machines during brief pauses. Laborers collapsed fully clothed onto shared beds. Workers nodded off in taverns, on carts, or beside hearths before meals were finished. This was not occasional tiredness. It was chronic depletion. And for the first time in European history, entire populations began living according to rhythms shaped primarily by industrial production rather than by natural light or agricultural cycles. Artificial lighting accelerated this transformation dramatically. Candles and oil lamps had already extended waking hours for centuries, but gas lighting in the 19th century changed urban night fundamentally. Factories could now operate longer and more reliably after dark. Streets remained active late into the evening. Shops extended business hours. Public life expanded deeper into nighttime. Darkness stopped functioning as a collective signal for rest. Again, the irony is striking. Increased illumination made cities appear more energetic and modern, while simultaneously reducing one of the oldest natural limits on human labor. Once night could be conquered technologically, employers and economies increasingly expected bodies to remain useful within it. Night work expanded, and night work reshapes the body in ways people immediately noticed even before modern sleep science existed. Shift workers became ill more often. Fatigue accumulated strangely. Appetite changed. Mood darkened. Concentration faltered. Industrial physicians and social reformers slowly began documenting these effects, especially among children. Child labor remains one of the clearest windows into industrial exhaustion because children reveal the limits of a system more visibly than adults. Reports from factories, mines, and workshops describe young workers waking before dawn, walking long distances, laboring through exhausting shifts, then returning home barely able to eat before sleep overtook them. Some children worked 14 or 16 hours during peak periods. Their exhaustion became political. Reformers described stunted growth, deformities, chronic illness, and emotional numbness among overworked children. Parliamentary investigations in Britain recorded testimony from workers too tired to think clearly by the end of the day. Children spoke of being beaten awake if they slowed near machines. Parents depended on wages desperately enough that refusing work was often impossible. And this is where the history of tiredness reveals something uncomfortable about modernity itself. Industrial society increased productivity enormously. It expanded wealth, technology, transportation, and eventually medicine. But in its early stages, it often did so by consuming human energy with extraordinary ruthlessness. Factories required disciplined bodies. Empires required disciplined bodies. Expanding capitalism required disciplined bodies. Sleep became obstacle as much as necessity. This does not mean industrialists sat consciously plotting to deprive workers of rest. The system itself created incentives that rewarded output, efficiency, punctuality, and continuous production. Employers competed against one another. Workers competed for survival. Cities competed commercially. Nations competed imperially. Fatigue became economically invisible unless it threatened productivity directly. And because industrial labor separated work from home more sharply than before, exhaustion acquired a new emotional quality as well. Medieval and early modern households had often blended labor, family, and survival together in the same spaces. Industrial workers increasingly traveled away from home into workplaces governed by external authority. The tired worker returned home already depleted. This altered family life profoundly. Parents had less energy for children. Meals became hurried. Sleep schedules fragmented. Women often carried dual burdens of wage labor and domestic responsibility simultaneously. In industrial districts, entire households operated around exhausting shifts. Some workers even practiced hotbedding, where multiple people used the same bed in rotation because housing was so crowded and work schedules so staggered. One exhausted body rose, another collapsed into the still warm mattress. The bed itself became industrialized. And yet, amid this exhaustion, industrial society also produced new ideas about rest. This is another important reversal. As fatigue intensified visibly, reformers, doctors, religious leaders, and eventually governments began treating sleep and recovery as social questions rather than purely personal ones. Debates emerged around working hours, Sunday rest, child labor laws, factory ventilation, and public health. In medieval society, exhaustion had largely been accepted as part of the natural structure of existence. By the 19th century, people increasingly argued that at least some forms of exhaustion were politically created and therefore politically changeable. That was a radical shift. The exhausted body became evidence. Doctors studying industrial workers observed alarming rates of injury, nervous disorders, lung disease, and collapse. Urban reformers described districts where overcrowding, poor sanitation, and overwork combined into permanent depletion. Novelists wrote about sleepless clerks, worn-out mothers, coughing laborers, and children too tired to remain awake in school. The industrial city itself seemed unable to rest. And there was something psychologically exhausting about industrial time beyond the physical labor alone. Medieval work had often varied in rhythm and task. Industrial labor became repetitive in unprecedented ways. The same motions repeated hour after hour beside machines moving at fixed speeds. Repetition drains attention differently from seasonal labor. A factory operative might stand in one position monitoring threads or parts for endless stretches while noise hammered continuously in the background. Mental fatigue merged with physical fatigue. Workers described becoming numb, detached, mechanically exhausted. Modern discussions of burnout, though framed differently, echo some of these experiences surprisingly closely. And alongside factories came another exhausted figure who would become increasingly familiar in modern history: the office worker. Industrial economies required administration on vast scales. Clerks, accountants, typists, railway schedulers, insurance agents, civil servants, and commercial managers filled expanding bureaucracies. Their labor looked cleaner than factory work, but it carried its own forms of depletion. Long hours indoors under artificial light strained eyes and posture. Sedentary repetition produced headaches and nervous complaints. Deadlines multiplied. Paperwork accumulated endlessly. The 19th century gradually discovered that mental labor could exhaust people profoundly too. This realization complicated older ideas about tiredness. For centuries, visible physical labor had dominated discussions of exhaustion. But industrial and commercial societies increasingly produced people who were tired without obvious physical strain. Railway systems intensified this transformation further. Trains compressed distance and accelerated expectations about time itself. Suddenly goods, letters, and people moved faster than older societies had imagined possible. Schedules became stricter. Delays became more disruptive. Entire populations adjusted their lives around timetables. The railway age trained societies to think mechanically about time. And mechanical time leaves little room for bodily variation. A worker arriving late because he slept poorly could lose wages or employment. A conductor falling asleep endangered lives. Industrial civilization demanded precision from tired human beings continuously. At the same time, cities grew noisier than anything medieval Europe had known. Steam engines, metalworks, rail yards, factories, street traffic, construction, and crowds created nearly constant urban sound. Nighttime quiet diminished further. This altered sleep quality profoundly even when people technically spent enough hours in bed. Historians examining 19th-century urban life often encounter complaints about insomnia, nervous agitation, overstimulation, and chronic weariness among both working and middle classes. The industrial city stimulated the senses relentlessly. Gaslights glowed late. Newspapers circulated rapidly. Financial markets fluctuated daily. Information accelerated. The mind itself struggled to slow down. And by the late 19th century, another extraordinary contradiction emerged. Industrial society had become productive enough that some people finally gained more physical comfort than medieval elites could have imagined. Softer mattresses, heated rooms, improved medicine, greater food variety, indoor plumbing. Yet many still felt exhausted. This puzzled observers. How could societies with more comfort produce so much fatigue? Part of the answer lay in expectation. Industrial capitalism steadily expanded the amount of activity considered normal. Productivity rose, but demands rose alongside it. Communication accelerated, but obligations multiplied. Comfort improved, but rest became psychologically harder. The body had escaped some older hardships only to encounter newer pressures. And increasingly, science itself entered the discussion. Researchers began studying sleep more systematically in the 19th century. Physicians explored nervous disorders, circadian rhythms, dreams, insomnia, and fatigue scientifically rather than solely morally or spiritually. Electricity transformed lighting further. Telegraphs compressed communication time radically. Human beings were entering a world where night could almost disappear technologically. And once societies learned to erase darkness almost completely, the ancient relationship between tiredness and the natural world weakened even further. Factories ran around the clock. Newspapers printed overnight editions. Financial markets connected distant cities. Hospitals operated continuously. Modern warfare mobilized entire populations industrially. The exhausted medieval peasant struggling through harvest season had never lived inside anything like this. Yet there was continuity too, because beneath all these transformations, the human body remained remarkably unchanged. Lungs still needed clean air. Muscles still needed recovery. Minds still needed periods of quiet. Children still required sleep for growth. Grief still disrupted rest. Anxiety still tightened the chest in darkness. Technology altered the conditions surrounding tiredness, but not the fundamental biological limits themselves. And as the 20th century approached, industrial civilization was preparing to test those limits on an even larger scale than before, through mass factories, electric light, global warfare, urban overstimulation, and eventually a culture in which staying constantly awake would begin to look not merely necessary, but admirable. And eventually, after centuries of pushing against darkness, weather, distance, and the body's own demands, the modern world would inherit something the medieval world understood more instinctively than we often do now: that human beings are not machines. The people of the Middle Ages did not possess modern sleep science. They did not know about circadian rhythms, cortisol, REM cycles, nervous systems, or industrial burnout. They explained exhaustion through religion, humors, morality, climate, imbalance, sin, and fortune. In many ways, their understanding of the body was incomplete, and yet they lived closer to one difficult truth. Tiredness was not an interruption to life. It was part of life. A peasant waking before dawn in winter cold, a monk struggling to stay awake during night prayers, a mother rising repeatedly beside a sick child, a sailor trying to sleep in rough seas, a laborer collapsing beside a dying hearth. These people were not failing at life because they were exhausted. Their exhaustion reflected the weight of survival itself. That does not mean medieval life was wiser, healthier, or more humane overall. Far from it. The Middle Ages were filled with hunger, disease, pain, inequality, fear, and relentless labor. Most people would not willingly trade places with them. Modern medicine, sanitation, heating, nutrition, and labor protections have spared millions from forms of suffering medieval people simply endured because they had no alternative. But the medieval world does quietly challenge one modern illusion. The illusion that with enough technology, enough productivity, enough discipline, enough optimization, human beings should no longer feel tired. History suggests otherwise. The medieval body ached from cold fields and smoky houses. The industrial body ached from factories and clocks. The modern body often aches from overstimulation, artificial light, anxiety, fragmented attention, isolation, and the strange pressure to remain permanently available. The forms change. The body remains human, and perhaps that is why this subject feels unexpectedly intimate across the centuries. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often picture armor, castles, cathedrals, plague carts, kings, monks, and battlefields. But most medieval people experienced history less dramatically. They experienced it while sleepy, while hungry, while sore, while carrying water in darkness, while trying to stay awake beside a fire after an exhausting day. History happened through tired eyes. A woman kneading bread before sunrise did not know she lived in the medieval period. A farmer repairing fences in freezing rain was not thinking about future historians. A clerk rubbing strained eyes beside candlelight did not imagine himself part of a great historical transition. They were simply trying to make it to tomorrow with enough strength left to continue. And there is something strangely calming in recognizing that continuity. Across 1,000 years of changing religion, technology, kingdoms, economies, and ideas, human beings remained vulnerable to the same basic limits. Sleep could restore them. Hunger could weaken them. Grief could exhaust them. Fear could keep them awake. Community could comfort them. Warmth could feel miraculous after cold. Even small moments of rest mattered deeply. A quiet bench outside a monastery wall after long labor. Shared laughter during a feast day. The warmth of animals in winter. The relief of removing wet boots near a fire. Bells finally silent after dark. A child asleep safely beside the hearth. Bread after scarcity. Spring after a punishing winter. Medieval people noticed these comforts because discomfort was so common. And perhaps modern viewers, listening quietly now from illuminated homes filled with technologies medieval kings could scarcely imagine, can still recognize the feeling underneath it all. The heavy eyes at the end of a long day. The longing for warmth, quiet, and safety. The simple human hope of finally resting. If there's one detail from this long journey through the exhausted medieval world that stayed with you most, or one part of medieval daily life you found hardest to imagine living through, I'd genuinely love to hear it in the comments. And if you'd like to return for more calm, thoughtful journeys into the stranger and more human corners of history, you're always very welcome here. For now, though, let the fires burn low, let the bells fade into the distance, and let the long medieval night finally grow quiet.